Okay. Hello, everybody. I know the last session just ended, so I'm going to give everyone a few seconds, hopefully to switch and settle. While you all are waiting, we have a poll, a question I would love to hear from all of you. It should be on the right side of your screen. The question is, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to innovative thinking? Hi, Madison. Hi, everyone. Okay, I see some folks starting to trickle in. So for the sake of time, I'm just going to go ahead and start. My name is Hannah Hartsig. I am the head of customer experience at Sling TV. I've been with Sling TV for the past about year and a half. And prior to that, I was working for a company for about 8 years where we consulted large retail and restaurant brands on CX strategy. So I have had a very unique privilege in my career to observe brands and how they implement disruptive thinking in their companies. Sometimes it works, and other times, often when disruptive thinking doesn't happen, their businesses don't progress. So this is a topic I am particularly passionate about. Before I start, I'm going to say something a little controversial. I have to be honest. The term disruptive thinking, I think it's become, I'm going to say, a little overused, a little buzzy, and quite honestly hoarded by what I'm going to call the Silicon Valley bro culture. Hopefully that's no offense to the Silicon Valley bros. But the problem with that is being a disruptor and thinking disruptively has become what I feel like is elusive and unattainable and something that's reserved for the Steve Jobs of the world. But the reality is disruptive thinking is just critical thinking. And critical thinking is just breaking down a seemingly complex problem to its most simplified core. So I'm not saying that disruptive thinking is easy, but it's certainly something that can be attained by any of us here today. So my intention for the next 20, 30 minutes is to hopefully demystify the term disruptive thinking for all of you, provide some concrete examples of disruptive thinkers from history as well as modern times, and then also to provide you with some concrete tactics and tools for you to put in your tool belt to start thinking disruptively within your own workplace. Before I get into that, I'm going to take a minute to talk about myself for just a minute and why I am so passionate about this topic. So I have now been in the CX space for about 10 years, which is wild. And I often get the question from people, what did you study that got you into CX? And I get uncomfortable and almost insecure when I answer that question because I studied art history. So shout out to all of the liberal arts ladies out there. I'm a big believer in the liberal arts education. But I get uncomfortable with my answer because sort of the typical next response after that is, oh, do you feel like you wasted your money? Do you feel like you wasted your time? Clearly, your job now has nothing to do with art history. But the reality is, I completely credit my liberal arts education to my ability to think critically, and I credit my advancement in my career to that critical thinking that I learned while I was in school. And as I was an undergraduate at Kansas State University, I studied history and art history. After that, I went on to Florence, Italy, where I got my master's in Renaissance art history. If you are in the liberal arts world, especially if you went to grad school for anything liberal arts, you are well aware that what that means is your professors are essentially exercising your brain every single day and challenging your thoughts, challenging what you think about a particular work of art, about what you read, about maybe what you learned in history. And they're encouraging you to form new ideas and new opinions. In addition to that education, living in Florence was great, obviously, for the pasta and gelato and Vespa rides, but it was also great because Florence, I'm going to say something else that might be offensive to some, was honestly sort of the Silicon Valley of the time. Florence, as many of you know, was the birthplace of the Renaissance, and the term Renaissance means rebirth. So we have some OG disruptors in Florence in the 14th and 15th century. So being surrounded by that energy every single day, I think really instilled in me a respect for and a desire to think about questioning my surroundings and being a disruptive thinker in my own right. So a little bit of context, a little bit of a history lesson. Again, many of you might already know this, but prior to the Renaissance was, of course, the Middle Ages. Another term for the Middle Ages was the Dark Ages. So what happens is in 15th, 16th century Florence, suddenly there's this sort of hotbed of thinkers who start to question everything from politics to philosophy, to the purpose of art and the purpose of architecture. And what they did is they changed the purposes of, again, basically all those different types of topics, and they disrupted what was happening in the Middle Ages. Now, a lot of those changes that happened in the Renaissance, we still feel in our society today. So my first example, of course, of a disruptor is going to be an art example. One of my favorite ladies in art history, the Mona Lisa. Now, the Mona Lisa was painted by a man, unfortunately, but she was the muse, so we're still going to consider her one of the disruptors. Okay, so I would say the second question that I get when people find out that I was an art history major after they might say something kind of condescending is they will ask me, what is the deal with the Mona Lisa? They suddenly become an art critic. They tell me they've been to the Louvre. They've seen her. She's small. The coloring is dark. She's not that good. So what is all the hoopla about? So without getting into a 6-hour lecture, I'm going to give you a brief overview of what the hoopla is about. And at its root, it's about disruption. So again, let's contextualize her. Leonardo da Vinci painted her in the early 1500s. Prior to the Renaissance, again, was the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there was a very singular purpose for art. It was to teach an illiterate population, to tell a story, most often a Bible story. Artists at the time weren't even really known or named. They were considered tradesmen the same way you would be a blacksmith or a baker or a tailor. So your job as an artist was to execute, to tell a story, and then to walk away. The Renaissance comes along, and suddenly we have artists who start to question and to push the purpose of art. So let's look at the Mona Lisa now. To this day, the Mona Lisa drives people crazy because she invokes far more questions than she gives answers. So, who is she? We still don't really know. There's some strong theories out there, but we don't really know. What is the background behind her? Why does it look kind of mystical? Where could she be? Why is she wearing dark clothing? And probably the most famous question of all time, why is she smiling? Again, woman, early 1500s, looking us in the eye and smiling. That would have been scandalous at the time, right? She's sort of inviting us into her space. So when you think about it, what Leonardo da Vinci has done is he's completely flipped the purpose of art at that time. And today, she seems like no big deal to us because Leonardo da Vinci disrupted, and now the purpose of art has sort of forever shifted. Okay, we'll pause on art history lessons for a minute and start to talk about some other examples. Uber, Airbnb, and Aldi. Uber and Airbnb, two fairly obvious disruptors. Aldi, one of my favorite stories we'll talk about here in just a minute. The common thread amongst all of these brands, at least for me personally, is they invoke the feeling of, why didn't I think of that first? So this starts to get a little bit into that dirty little secret of disruptive thinking. I am going to harken back on my sorority days for just a minute when I was an Alpha Delta Pi at K-State. When we had sorority recruitment, our sort of mantra that we learned when we were talking to a potential new member was find a need, fill a need. So if I can tell that that potential new member is maybe feeling a little homesick, I'm going to talk to her about the sisterhood, for example. Well, that's really what all of these disruptive brands are doing at their core. They're finding a need and they're filling it. Uber found a need. It's really hard to get around if you don't live in a city with a lot of taxis or don't have good access to cab stands. Airbnb found that people want to have more authentic experiences when they travel. And then there's Aldi. So Aldi was founded in post-World War II Germany. At the time, the economy was completely decimated and people didn't have money to buy food. So Aldi found a need. People can't afford food. And they filled it by creating a hyper-efficient grocery store model where they were able to pass through labor savings to the customer, making the food cheaper for the customers to purchase. So again, none of these ideas are groundbreaking. If you really, really think about it, they all make perfect, simple sense. What is genius about all of these brands, and I think where we often get stuck, is opening up our brains to new possibilities. So all of these brands thought of something that no one else had thought of before because we had barriers in our minds. We had limitations. When you travel, you stay in a hotel. If you need a ride, you call a taxi. And so these brands were able to get through those barriers, open up their minds so they could think of what's quite honestly pretty logical and pretty simple solutions. So now what we're going to do is we are going to switch gears and start to talk a little bit about tactics that will help us think more disruptively in the workplace. Okay, before I do that, I'm going to pause because we have our poll results back. So the question for the poll was, what do you believe is the biggest barrier to innovative thinking? The first one was lack of resources and funding. 11% of you said that. Number 2, resistance to change from leadership or colleagues, 21%. 40% of you said it was fear of failure and risk-taking. And then 21% of you said lack of time. So what's very interesting about that and eye-opening, by far and away the winner is that fear of failure and risk-taking. I completely understand that. That resonates with me. I certainly felt that way for a while. I still feel that way occasionally. I'm hoping that talking about the fact that disruptive thinking is much simpler than people think it is will give you all some confidence to start trying this out in the workplace. And hopefully some of these tactics are things that you can start using to build your confidence. Okay, let's dig in. So the first thing that I do when I am approaching a tough problem is called the Minto method. The Minto method was invented by Barbara Minto, which is great. We've got a woman now. She went to Harvard Business School. She was a consultant at McKinsey, and she came up with what's really a pretty simple framework. I use this framework, I'm not kidding when I say every single day. So this is my first step when I'm approaching a problem, which is defining and nailing down really specifically the problem I'm trying to solve. I use this when I'm talking to my boss and I need his help thinking something through. I use this when someone from my team brings a problem to me. It helps us break things down and simplify it. So here's how it works. The first thing we do is define what is the situation at hand. The second thing is what is that complication that's making this a problem? Third, what is the specific question that we need to answer? And fourth, what is that answer going to be? Okay, so let's look at a specific example. This actually happened at work about a month ago, and we'll see if this helps crystallize this for all of you. So Sling TV, as part of the CX team, we have a voice of customer team. That voice of customer team is constantly collecting feedback from our customers. One way we do that is through an NPS survey, which is a relationship survey. So, situation, Sling TV emails NPS surveys to 2,000 customers per day. 1% of those customers respond. Great. What's the problem there? Well, the complication of that situation is that when we look at our respondent base, we find out that those respondents are older and they're more tenured than our general population. Happy to hear from them, but if we're making decisions off of this data, we have a huge blind spot to the rest of our customer base. So, what is our question? Our question is, how do we attract a more representative sample to take that NPS survey? The answer was that we're going to test out some methodologies such as text message and push notifications to try to get feedback from those maybe younger customers. So that is how we sort of framed the problem and got to a very clear, here's our solution. We're starting those tests now, and we'll see how they go. What I did not tell you, though, is how we got from the question to the answer. That is really that piece where that critical thinking happens. But me personally, I need to do all of that pre-work to make sure that critical thinking component, that answer, is something that is achievable for me. Okay, so how do we start that critical thinking process? The Socratic method. So if you have a legal background, or if you went to law school, or if you've seen Legally Blonde, you know what the Socratic method is. The way we define the Socratic method, invented by Socrates, as you might gather, in ancient Greece, is it is hypotheses elimination, and that better hypotheses are found by steadily identifying and eliminating those that lead to contradictions. Even the definition is a little heavy. So another way we can think about this, another way I think about this, is the Vivian Norris method. Vivian Norris is my 5-year-old niece. And Vivian Norris uses the Socratic method on me every time I see her, and it is obnoxious. It's basically asking somebody why over and over and over again until they are mentally broken down and all of their preconceived notions of why things are, they start questioning. And as annoying as that is, it's really helpful in breaking down some of those barriers I talked about earlier that often prevent us from thinking disruptively. I won't get into it, but the other day I had a conversation with Viv about high school and why people go. And by the end of it, I was questioning our whole educational system. Okay. Next method, visual thinking strategy. So I stole this one from back in the day. I was a tour guide at the Nelson Atkins Museum of Art. Shout out to anybody on here from KC. And visual thinking strategy is really common in museums. It's what guides will use when they're taking patrons around to look at a work of art. Instead of standing in front of that work of art and lecturing about what's happening in it, it's a series of 3 questions that prompts the patrons to interact, to ask questions, and to essentially arrive at those conclusions on their own. So what they're doing is they're thinking critically about that work of art. First question, what's going on here? Second, what do you see that makes you say that? And third, what more can we find? Again, super simple, but an amazing way to really unlock your brain. So let's do one more quick example on this one. I won't make you all suffer through another art history lesson. This time we'll look at another work example. So I'm on the customer experience team. I lead that team for Sling. What we're doing all day, every day is we're dissecting customer experiences and figuring out how we can make them better. A new tool that we have, Quantum Metric, hashtag not an ad. Quantum's a great partner. They allow us to essentially replay sessions of customers on our website. So something we'll do often, the product team does often, is we'll pull up these videos and you can watch a customer trying to do a certain activity on your website. In this particular case, it's just a screenshot, but the customer was essentially trying to buy Sling. So a question we would start with is, what's going on here? Someone might say, well, this customer seems to be struggling as they're trying to pick out their package. The next question, what do you see that makes you say that? Well, they're moving their cursor around a lot. They're hitting the back button. They're rage clicking. And then we say, okay, what more can we find? And by doing this over and over and over again, we really get into the customer's brain and we pinpoint the problem we need to solve. And suddenly the solution becomes much more clear. So just a different way you can approach kind of trying to crack the nut of what's the real problem and then how do we solve it. The last strategy I'm going to give you is actually in response to a question, a really great question that I got before I had this talk today. I have it written down, so let me find it for you guys real quick. The question was, I'm almost there. I have a lot of paper. Okay. In my experience, disruptive thinking takes a significant emotional investment on a near constant basis. What are some ways you refuel yourself? This is a great question because if you guys notice, all of the methods before this are all about getting our brain to the right space where we can think of these innovations, where we can think of these new ideas. But I haven't actually gotten to the part where those new ideas arrive. So the method I use for that is called white space. I went to a client conference several years back and I heard Juliet Funt speak. Juliet Funt is the author of the book White Space in the Workspace. Again, not an ad. It's an amazing book. I highly recommend it. And essentially what her theory is that strategic pause between activities allows for innovation. There's a really good quote in the book that says, the pause or the silence is where we innovate. I needed to hear this because I'm a little bit of a busybody. I love being productive. So in my workday, if I have 2 minutes between meetings, I am diving into my email, I'm diving into my chats, I'm seeing how many tasks I can get knocked out. But when we do that, we're preventing our brain that might be freshly opened up to new ideas from finding those new ideas. So a couple of things I do now. One, I try my hardest. It is very hard, I will be honest, to pad in little breaks throughout my day, even if they're 15 minutes. When you come out of a meeting and your wheels are spinning, you don't want to stop that momentum by immediately going to the next one. So giving yourself a little bit of a pause to marinate is where you'll come to those good ideas. Again, easier said than done. The second thing I will do is I will give myself some grace between meetings, between calls, when my brain goes just a little fuzzy for a minute, to let my brain go fuzzy, to zone out, to lean into it, because that's where the ideas come. I think good proof of this is when you wake up in the middle of the night and you have a great idea, or in my case, you've thought of the comeback that you should have thought of sooner in the day. It's because your brain can finally rest, so it can finally think of those good ideas. So white space is my recommendation for how I personally refuel, and I think it can be really helpful for others as well. Okay, that brings us to the end of our content for the day. I've been doing a lot of talking. Hopefully, you are all feeling good about the fact that disruptive thinking, not that big of a deal. Anyone can do it. And you feel good about some new tools you can put in your tool belt to start implementing that. Okay, I need to see how much time we have left. I think we have about 7 minutes left. So I will answer some questions. Let's see. Okay. A lot of good comments in here. Sorry, guys, give me a minute. I'm trying to find my questions. Feel free to pop them in the comments. I think that's going to be probably the best place for me to find them. There's a lot of good stuff in here, so I'm searching through them. I think Daniela was going to put some in the chat. Okay. I'm actually not seeing a lot. Let me know if I'm wrong, Daniela, and there's anything that I can answer. But I appreciate everybody's great comments and appreciation for my art history lessons. I didn't want to overwhelm you. Oh, Tracy had a question. What was the third question again with the visual thinking strategy? That visual thinking strategy, I think that was actually as it pertained to one of those methods. So looking at a work of art and sort of thinking critically about it rather than lecturing about it. Definitely Googleable. I'm sure we can probably send this content out afterwards as well. Okay. Rebecca asked, how do I, with my tone, become an effective disruptor? Rebecca, I think you mean how do I change my tone, but would you mind clarifying that a little bit? Oh, there's a QA tab. Oh my gosh, you guys, how did I miss that? I'm in the comments tab. I'm glad Lauren, also a fellow art historian. That's great. All right. I'm so sorry, guys. I do not see the QA tab on mine. This might be my technical difficulty moment coming in. Oh, Karen. Karen better understood your question, Rebecca. So what was the third question in visual thinking strategy? Yes, it is what more can we find? Okay. I am not seeing questions, but I am thinking there are probably more coming in, and I am maybe just having a little bit of a technical difficulty. So I will get with the Fairy God Boss team and see if there's anything we can do for me to answer some of those and then possibly send those out afterwards. Okay. Although Daniela did just send me one good one. She said, how do you overcome the fear of a bad idea? That is such a good question, and quite honestly, a really, really difficult one. There's not a great answer for this. I'll tell you how I personally came over it. it's one of those questions where it's like the only way out is through. So when I was back in my consulting role, I would have presentations for boards of, quite honestly, older white men who saw a younger woman coming in trying to, what they presumed was tell them how to run their business. And that was such a hard scenario to be in, but I would say also very empowering. When I started my career, I was very intimidated to ever suggest new ideas. And as I got more confident in my consulting and I would start to share those ideas and you would get positive feedback, you'll find your confidence slowly start to grow. So I think the best answer there is, again, probably the only way out is through, and to just have confidence in yourself. You are in your role for a reason, so start suggesting those ideas, and I think you'll get much better feedback than you think you will, and that will help build your confidence over time. Okay, we also got one. Are you hiring? You're someone I want to work with. Oh, that makes me so happy. So I will say this, at this exact moment, we don't have any open roles, but that will likely be changing in the next couple of weeks. So keep your eye out on the Sling career board. I think Madison, who works for Dish, posted a link to that, and would love to connect. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn as well. Happy to chat with you there. Okay, how do you promote creative thinking for your team? That's a great question. Well, I am very lucky to have a team of very creative thinkers already. But I think it's really important that as much as I'm promoting them to be creative, that they push back and promote me to be creative as well. One of the ways we do that, quite honestly, is the Minto method. If any of them are on this call, they're probably rolling their eyes for the number of times they'll come to me with a problem. And I say, okay, let's use the Minto method to work through it. Another way I think is just by giving your team the rope, right? I trust my team, and I think that is really important. I trust them to come up with creative solutions. And the reality is, when you do the work for somebody, they'll never get there on their own. So I think empowering your team, sometimes letting them skid their knees a little bit, is how they'll grow and how they'll develop those creative thinking skills. Okay. I think I have time for one more. What do you think about, I like this one. What do you think about just do it, then ask for forgiveness later in terms of disruptive thinking? I will say this, I love it with a degree of responsibility behind it, right? If I say that and my bosses are watching, they'll probably start to get a little bit nervous. But I think to a certain point, we have to take risks, but it's also important to be responsible in those risks that we're taking. Typically, the way I approach it at work is, if I have a big risk to take and I need to go get the buy-in, what I do and what I focus on is, first and foremost, put together a rock solid story that well articulates why you need to take that risk. And then usually it's a very easy sell for whoever needs to potentially sign off on that, or feel good about the decision that you're making. But I do like the concept for sure. Sometimes we just need to push the limits. Okay, I think we are out of time. Daniela, tell me if I'm wrong on that, but I've really enjoyed being here today. Again, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, and I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your